Hello, hello. Welcome to Transmuting Poverty Consciousness to Trillionaire Consciousness in Real Time. Now, that might sound like a tall order, but I promise you it's actually not as complicated as your mind wants to make it to be. It's complex, but it's not complicated. The mind creates complication. Nature, everything you see in existence around you, is highly, highly complex, but it's also simple. And it makes sense. And so I'm excited to share this with you because these are recent downloads that I've received, and due to the newness of the information, I also just want to say that, my word is not truth. There is maybe no such thing as empirical truth. Currently, the only truth that I can feel really good about saying feels like it's universal is the truth of polarity, of opposites. And beyond that, it's just really it's opinion, and it's experience, and it's choice. It's ultimately it's the choice of what do you choose to believe as truth or accept as truth in your experience, because whatever that is going to very radically shape your human journey. It's going to shape your time in this body on this planet, and you have more power than you think. So see if this resonates. Listen not necessarily with your mind, but drop your awareness into your heart so that you can allow the intelligence of your heart, which is actually far more equipped to make decisions, real, truthful, intuitive decisions for ourselves individually than the mind is, and take what works and release what doesn't. But my intention for this transmission is truly to just share what is coming through for me in ceremonial settings. With the intentions that I've had recently have been to really transmute my own scarcity conversations, poverty consciousness, and debt consciousness, which I've been working on actively for years now. And it's like it moves in cycles. So every time I move through a big realization, or I graduate to a new level of awareness, and I release an old program or an old way of being that no longer serves me, it's like there's a whole new level of the game that's unlocked. And with that whole new level of the game, there's new information and new challenges, and you get to see, the shrapnel, I call it the shrapnel, like the little splinters of these old programs that we've been carrying in our cellular bodies for many, many, many eons, that are now swiftly coming to the surface to be transmuted. And so I want to just briefly, because I'm going to go into this more at the end, but I just want to acknowledge that, yes, there is a PayPal button here on this page. And the reason that I chose to essentially make it an open invitation for you to choose whether you feel like exchanging energy with me in the form of financial exchange is because this is actually precisely the gift that I'm here to give, which is to bring awareness to how we can relate to and interact with money differently, so that we can start to actually, through each transaction, begin to transmute the collective field around the money conversation, period. And so you have the opportunity, if you so choose, at the end of this video, if it feels, like you received a lot of information that was really useful to you, and you acknowledge me for all the work that I've done to be able to bring through this information, and all the countless hours I've invested into becoming who I am today so that I can share this authentically with you. If you feel like basically, throwing the ball back to me and sharing some of your resources, some of your energy with me in the form of financial exchange, I am gratefully receiving that. I have no expectations. I have no attachments. I don't have a need, but I will use it. I will absolutely use it. I will recycle it. I think of myself as like a living Brita filter. And we all are this. It's just how much, how deeply are we willing to accept that we are. But essentially, through our bodies, we can transmute frequency, right? We are alchemists, and I'll get more into the specifics of that. And so when money comes into my field, whatever the amount, I essentially transmute it in my system, which is vibrating at a very high frequency of love and a deep devotion to unity and restoring harmony on planet Earth. And then I essentially allow that energy to circulate back out of my system with the intention of unity and love and connection. And so whatever manifestation that ends up taking, whatever form that takes, whether it's pouring it into a creative project or pouring it into my personal growth, hiring support so that I can continue on this very accelerated trajectory of evolution, it will be put to good use. So more to that later. So to begin, I really want to just kind of give you guys a very broad overview of my worldview, essentially. And again, this is not truth with a capital T. There may or may not be such a thing. But as I said a little bit earlier, the one truth that I do accept as true with a capital T is the truth or the reality of polarity, meaning of opposites. And the reason why, after many, many, many hours of careful deliberation around this and consulting some of the brightest minds that I know, the reason why I feel comfortable saying that is because in order for there to be anything that we experience in existence today, your body, your apartment, the food in your fridge, this entire universe, there has to be a playground of polarity, meaning a playground of opposites. So that allows, through the interplay of light and shadow, to create things, stuff, experience, right? And so the way I want you to visualize this, and I'm going to try and keep it short because this is essentially just a foundation upon which to then understand trillionaire consciousness. But if you think of, for the sake of simplicity and for the mind to be able to grasp this, imagine all of creation is kind of going to be explained through a diagram that's like an upside-down triangle, okay? And so at the top of this upside-down triangle, we have source. We have all that is. We could call this God. We could call this, infinite awareness. Whatever you want to call it, essentially it's describing that which is eternal and infinite in nature and contains everything within it. So it's actually impossible for our minds, for our human minds, to grasp that conceptually because it's so vast and so infinite in nature. But really what we're talking about is we're talking about light. We're talking about information. And so information is data, right? It's essentially all the potential that could exist in the universe that exists in a vacuum as data. Now, in order for source or creator, God, whatever you want to call it, to have an experience of itself and actually do something with all of the vastness of its potential, it must create a split. It must split itself into two, essentially, in order to have something to reflect back to it what it is. There's no way for it to understand what it is unless it actually creates something to have a comparison to. And so the first law of the universe and the truth that I accept as true with a capital T is polarity, which is essentially this original split from source, which allows for the opposite of what source is to experience, which is essentially the darkness, right? It's the contrast. So we can talk about this in all sorts of different ways. We can use the words light and dark, or love and fear. But really what we're talking about is a spectrum. And I want to credit my beloved Adam for this because he's the one who explained this to me originally in a way that actually made sense to me. And he said, if you think about it, you can't add dark to a room. You can only take away the visible light. And so really there is no such thing as dark. There's only a spectrum of visible light. And so the less visible light you have, the more you start to enter into the experience of what we would label dark. But dark is actually not even a thing. It's just the thing that we describe to measure the absence of light. So Whether you want to look at this through the lens of light and dark, or you want to look at it through the lens of fear and love, essentially we're talking about Source choosing to forget that it is Source, that it is infinite, that it is eternal, that it is divine, and plunge itself into the battlefield of duality, in which it now has the opportunity to go on this extraordinary adventure or scavenger hunt or journey or hero's journey, as we traditionally know in storytelling, to remember what it is so that it can experience itself. It must forget so that it can remember. We cannot actually remember something that we have not forgotten. And so essentially, these varying degrees of density, so again, to come back to the diagram, if at the top here there's no density, it's just pure Source, right? It just is. And it's the most concentrated, form of data and potential that exists. Then as it splits into density, and the bottom of this triangle, this upside down triangle down here, would essentially, that point at the bottom would measure the complete and total absence of light, of consciousness, of awareness, okay? So we're looking at it like this, and essentially everything that's in between my hands is going to be a grayscale. It's going to be a gradient from light to dark, from love to fear. We're going to be playing in essentially what we would now call the dimensions of density. So currently, as we know, we live in a time-space reality. We live in the third dimension, meaning we live in a 3D holographic experience that we experience as life or reality. And the third dimension has certain rules. It has certain laws, right? Currently, like the law of attraction, for example, and also the law of gravity and various other laws that we currently adhere to. Now, and believe me, I'm not a scientist. I'm not a physicist. I was terrible at all of those subjects in school. All of this information that I'm sharing with you has literally just come through me as I've began to awaken my multidimensional awareness and expand my consciousness outside of my normal day-to-day reality. And I'll talk more about that later. So, if at the top you have pure Source and at the bottom you have essentially the opposite of that, which is, the most dense, the most unconscious experience, then the question is, right, like we're moving up. So we're actually moving in a cyclical fashion because we only think of growth as linear in time-space reality, but when everything is existing all at the same time in the quantum field of infinite possibility, which is most of the universe because it does not adhere to time and space, that's just true for this particular dimension, then it's really the cyclical expansion, and it's expanding in all directions simultaneously, so it can get complicated to try and envision this. I'm trying to keep it as simple as possible and in the way that I understand. So essentially, they say there's 12 dimensions, okay, and within those dimensions there's like almost like octaves, on a piano. There's subcategories within the dimensions, but let's just say for the sake of simplicity, there's 12 dimensions, and we are currently at the third dimension, meaning we have evolved our consciousness in physical form, playing in the field of density, to a point where now we are existing in 3D, and we are very rapidly, through a variety of reasons, now moving into fifth dimensional awareness. So what does that actually mean? Well, the fifth dimension, if you have this here, and I was hoping I would have a whiteboard to draw this on because it would be better, but it's just didn't happen. So if you have this here as your diagram, and the third dimension is somewhere around here, right, like 1, 2, 3, all the way up to 12, then we're now starting to move into the fifth dimension on a consciousness level, meaning we are now able to tap into an experience of less density. So density, the way that I can explain density most easily is if you think about the pace at which things move. So if you run through air, it's going to be easier to run faster through air than it is going to be to run through water or than to run through mud. Now, that doesn't make mud or water bad or wrong. It simply means that water has more density than air and mud has more density than water. And so therefore, the speed at which you are moving is slowed down because you are dealing with more pushback. And this is extremely important to know because many of us are trapped in density, meaning aspects of ourself that have not become awakened, have not become conscious, have not been essentially have not remembered who and what they are by the light of awareness being shown upon them. These forgotten, fragmented aspects of ourself that occurred by default when we chose to split from Source and we fragmented or fractalized into all these various expressions of Source that are now perceived separate. In order for the game to even work, the sacrifice was separation. Those aspects of self, those little fragments, they cannot vibrate at the frequency of the fifth dimension if they're still trapped in the third dimension because they haven't yet caught up. They're still trapped by the density of the third dimension, if that makes sense. And so in this transition, really what we're talking about using the density, meaning using these fragmented aspects of self that usually occur through some sort of trauma, and all of us have gone through this process for many lifetimes and have accumulated tremendous amounts of trauma in this journey of coming back to self-awareness and coming back to remembering who and what we truly are. And in order for us to actually ascend, we must shed, or rather transmute, these lower density aspects of self because they cannot vibrate in the same frequency. So looking at this whole game of existence from the lens of vibration and frequency, there are certain frequencies that are simply incompatible, right? And so just in the same way that our ears are not currently equipped to pick up on certain higher frequencies that our dog might be able to pick up on, really all that means is the receptor, the antenna that's there to receive the transmission, the frequency, which is existing all around us, all frequencies existing all around us at all times, is not tuned. So like a radio station trying to find that signal, and it's just static, we have to actually develop our antenna to be able to both receive and then calibrate to the new frequency. And the only way to actually do that fully, and not just partly, is to piece by piece identify all these aspects of self that we've rejected and abandoned. And so this is why the work is the healing process. It's literally a willingness to step into the inner work and piece by piece, memory by memory, begin to identify and embrace every single aspect of self that we have rejected and abandoned somewhere along the way. Because the result of coming into density and forgetting that we are creator, just in the disguise of a human body, permanently or impermanently having forgotten that we made up this whole game to begin with, we have been essentially blindfolded, by duality, and we've had to rely on instincts, and instincts have been all about survival. And so there's been a tremendous amount of murder and war and just profound violence that has occurred, which you can see when you look through the history books. And there's a tremendous amount of forgiveness that must happen in order for us to realize that not only did we have to actually go through all of that pain and suffering, because we needed the separation to give us the incentive to come back to wholeness and to essentially spark that remembering, but we have the ability now to choose a different way. We have the ability now to choose a new experience. And so I'm going to continue this conversation in the following video. I'm trying to keep these somewhat bite-sized so that it doesn't turn into this 2-hour one video where it can get really confusing to find things. But we shall continue in just a moment.